Okay, so good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Catherine Baxter, and I'm very pleased to be hosting this session. The English Association is a learned society and subject association which was founded in 1906 to promote, support, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you very much today to Jayne Carroll, who's joining us, and to Linda Pratt, who's hosting going to be introducing this session for us. Our members make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying membership fees. And if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support our discipline, please consider joining us. So it costs about £1 a week to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year. And through membership, you'll get access to a range of benefits, including online access to all our journals. Okay, it's my pleasure to hand over to our speakers now for our discussion about place names, landscape futures, and farming practices in Shropshire and beyond. And I'm going to hand over to Linda Pratt in the first instance, who's going to introduce our speaker, Jayne Carroll. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks very much, everyone, for coming along and giving up your lunch break to do so. It gives me huge pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Jayne Carroll is actually a colleague of mine, and I'm very lucky to have her as a colleague as well. Jayne is Professor in Early English and Name Studies at the University of Nottingham. And as you'll see, the title of her talk today is Place Names, Landscape Futures and Farming Practices in Shropshire and Beyond. So Jayne, over to you.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks very much. It's really lovely to be here today. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm a place name specialist. My background is in the early medieval languages of England and Scandinavia, but I now work on names right from prehistory through to the present day. And today I'm going to be talking about collaborative projects that have made use of place names in various ways in the rural West Midlands. But first of all, I'm just going to give you a quick word about place names for anyone who's unfamiliar with them in the context of academic study. So in short, place names are a really fantastic source for many different types of history. Most of them originated as meaningful phrases, short descriptive texts. Many of them would have come into existence in the speech of ordinary people, people who had an intimate relationship with a landscape. So they tend to preserve the voices of people who are not necessarily otherwise well represented in the written record. English settlement names, so the names of towns and villages, they're usually very old, with origins in the early medieval period, and they would have been given by speakers of Old English and Old Norse. But more minor names, like field names, they tend not to hang around in use for quite as long. So there's much more of a turnover of those kinds of minor names. So as land use and land ownership change, you tend to get changes in names as well. So they behave a bit differently from settlement names. But all of the names can tell us a lot about people's relationships with their surrounding environments and how those environments were used and perceived. And another really great thing about place names, people really like them. So it's very easy to use them to engage people. Now, the collaborations that I'm going to talk about today arose out of work done as part of an AHRC funded research project. So this is a project that ran from 2013 to 2016. And it was a project to complete a county survey, a county place name survey of Shropshire. So we were analysing collections of early spellings in order to determine the likely origins of the names and what they meant when they were descriptive labels, and then to investigate their potential significances for linguistic, social and cultural, political and administrative histories. So in our application for this project, as you did back then, we outlined pathways to impact that we were going to use to disseminate our research beyond the academy. And it was really quite traditional outreach work. So we had a travelling exhibition, lots of media engagement, a conference for non-academics, that sort of thing, and lots of talks to members of the public. And of course, the more talks you do, the more talks you are asked to do. At one such talk in Ludlow in March 2016, this was given by me and also by John Baker, who was the senior research fellow on the project. And in the audience of that talk in Ludlow were two quite key people. A woman called Sarah Jameson, who works for CPRE, the countryside charity, and also a woman called Karen Limbrick, who now works for an organisation called Educating Kids Outdoors. Now, they saw the potential of our material for work with primary school children. And in particular, they thought that we ought to be in touch with the Community and Landscapes Officer for what was then the Shropshire Hills AOMB. So the Community and Landscapes Officer was and is a really wonderful person called Kath Landals, and she was indeed very interested in our work and how she might be able to use it. So Kath has really close relationships with primary schools in her area in South Shropshire. And ultimately, to cut quite a long story short, our relationship with her led to a successful follow-on funding application to the HRC, led by my colleague John Baker, who was the research fellow. Along with an engagement fellow, we worked with Kath and with educators in rural primary schools and museums to produce resources for use in the classroom, in museums, on field trips, and actually also at home, because the project launched in January 2020, which was a bit of a complicating factor. So we ended up actually providing quite a lot of resources for people who were suddenly put into the position of home educating their kids. But actually, my focus today isn't on that project. That project was, though, a foundational collaboration with Kath Landals for what came next. So Kath got to know more about our material as we were working with her on the schools project, but she thought that our material should be put to use not just in schools, but in nature recovery contexts. Minor names, field names in particular, are a really fine-grained record of landscape and land use. And because they're liable to replacement, they record changes in landscape and land use over time. So Kath ended up putting us in touch with colleagues at the National Trust, with whom she was collaborating on a landscape scale project called Stepping Stones. And you can see at the top of the screen the aims of that project. So the geographical focus for this project was on the Upper Onny catchment area. That's between for those of you who know Shropshire, it's between the Long Mynd and the Stiper Stones. So the Long Mynd and the Stiper Stones are both part of the Shropshire Hills AOMB. And the aim of the project really was to create an environmental corridor between those two areas. So the Stepping Stones project was in particular working with a farming community, the Upper Onny Farmers Group, towards this end. And we became associated with the project with support from an Impact Accelerator Award and also with quite a lot of seed corn funding from the National Trust. And you can see on the slide at the bottom what our particular remit was within the Stepping Stones project. So the Upper Onny Farmers Group, they were a really engaged bunch, and they were already interested in historic field names, largely because of the work of this man, George Foxall, in the 1970s and 80s. So Foxall, during those decades, he redrew the mid-19th century tithe award maps for Shropshire. He redrew them to scale using OS maps, and he transferred onto them the field names from the accompanying schedules. So the tithe schedules were keyed to the maps through numbers, and they have lots of information in about tenants, owners, land use, and the names of each individual field. So on the screen you can see Foxall's map of Clunton Township in Clunbury Parish in South Shropshire. This isn't actually in the Upper Onny area. This is a little bit further south. But the maps are absolutely gorgeous. They're really, really simple, but they're just so wonderful to work with. So with the Upper Onny Farmers Group, we worked with them to explain what earlier names meant or meant when they came into existence. So we worked with the tithe award names from the mid-19th century, but we also worked with medieval names where we had them for the areas that they were farming. And we explored them to think about what the names could tell them about their land and what was happening there in past times. And we also recorded the field names that the farmers themselves use today for their fields, because of course they are actually just as informative about land use and perceptions and the relationships with landscape. And we really wanted to stress the importance of those names as intangible cultural heritage that needed to be recorded for the future. And we wanted to really stress the idea that the farmers were guardians not just of landscape, but also with its associated linguistic heritage. So this shows the precise area that we were working in, and that the coloured polygons on the map, those are the individual fields of the various Upper Onny farms, and you can see on the inset exactly where we are within England. So we're right on over in the west on the Welsh border. If you look at the OS map, you can see Stiper stones here. In the west, and the Long Mynd a little bit further south, but you can see the area is sandwiched between the two. That's the Upper Onny. Okay, so this is what we did. We worked with 13 farms covering over 600 square kilometres of land. The initial meetings with the farmers were all facilitated by Kath Landals. Okay, she was absolutely key to the collaboration. She already worked really closely with them. And Susan Kilby, our engagement fellow, she spent time on every single farm. And she recorded interviews, often not just with the main farmer, but with the entire farming family. And on one occasion, she actually had 4 generations sitting around the farmhouse kitchen table. And during the course of these interviews and farm visits, she recorded more than 500 field names in current use. And she also recorded the stories that came along with them. So often that the names came with stories of how they had arisen. And sometimes she found those stories were actually being passed on to younger generations for the first time. So parents and grandparents were passing on narratives to sons and daughters and grandchildren that they had never told them before. So it was triggering a lot of really quite interesting interactions, which we hadn't necessarily anticipated at all. So you can see some of the modern names on the slide. Some of these are actually survivals from the mid-19th century and earlier. So Scutchy Peace, for example, that's on the tithe maps from the 19th century. Scutchy refers to couch grass. So that's a dialect term for couch grass. So we recorded the names in a GIS, a Geographic Information System. So that meant that we could make the material available to the farmers digitally in a web app. And Susan actually also created for each farm a hand-drawn field name map, which was inspired by the Foxhall maps. And the farmers really loved these. And we know that a lot of them have actually had them framed and mounted on their walls. And some of what we learnt from the farmers really fed back into our own research. So the modern names that the farmers used were the same typologically as names dating right back to the medieval period. So the types of names that we were used to dealing with and analysing, but usually for which we lacked any account of the precise motivations for naming. And we were getting information about precise motivations from the farmers. So I'm just going to give you a couple of really simple examples of things that we learnt from the farmers about why names were given that we could then think about in relation to our older material. So just to take a name, for example, that might have survived from the 17th century all the way into the late 19th century and beyond, a field called Wheatfield. Seems quite transparent. It's a field where wheat grew, but crops are rotated. Sometimes you have turnips in that field, or clover, or rye. So why does wheat stick? Why does a field gain and then keep the name Wheatfield? Why not one of the other crops? Well, that's absolutely self-evident to these modern day farmers. They have a really simple answer. It's the crop that thrives best in that field. You can't use it for wheat all the time, but it's great when you can. Another example, say a field is called something like Sam Johnson's field. Again, it seems quite obvious. Presumably Sam Johnson owned that field, but it became clear that a name like that was given at the point at which Sam Johnson sold the field to somebody else. So only then, when it was no longer Sam Johnson's field, did it gain his name. So those are very, very simple examples, but the discussions sometimes gave us a framework to better understand the motivation of earlier names. So the National Trust were really pleased because they reported an unusually high level of farmer engagement with our part of the Stepping Stones project, and they were really keen to extend the collaboration. So with their support, we put together another follow-on funding application. And this was to try and scale up a little bit to work with National Trust tenant farmers across the county, so across Shropshire, but also to think about how our work could inform their work nationally in their so-called accelerator places. So accelerator places are trust properties that have particularly extensive nature recovery programs. And they also wanted us to try and train their staff to provide training for their staff across the country in the use of place names in this kind of context. So with this project, with this group, we were trying to engage a really quite different constituency from the Upper Onny Farmers Group. So the Upper Onny Group were landowners who, to a certain extent, were able to make their own decisions, although, of course, they're working within really strict constraints. But National Trust farmers were, of course, tenants, and they were subject to National Trust policy and decisions, to trust schemes for environment improvement and that kind of thing. They're not in control in the same way as the Upper Onny farmers were. And also historically, the relationship between the trust and its tenant farmers has sometimes been strained. So they were, as a whole, a more challenging group to work with. So it ranged from individuals who were absolutely delighted to participate, all the way through to people who just refused to answer the door. And there was a slight suspicion of anything that the National Trust sent their way, and we were sent their way by the National Trust. And also with the Upper Onny group, we'd really benefited from having Kath Landals as a single point of contact through whom we reached the farmers. And they saw her as very much working for them and on their side. With the National Trust tenants, we worked with different National Trust estate managers to reach the farmers. And the relationships were simply more complicated than with Kath, and that made a huge difference to the success of the collaboration. There were successes. So we were able to provide the trust with lots of data in the form of layers to import into their GISs with details of present day and historical field names and the information that those names provided on geology, crops, flora, fauna, archaeology, historical practices, and they could use that information in their planning for nature recovery schemes. In terms of the training, we'd planned to offer at the end of the project two-day workshops for trust staff from right across the UK at two different sites. But the timing turned out to be really bad because these workshops coincided with restructuring and redundancies at the trust in the very job families that we were targeting. So to start with, when we announced the workshops, we had really healthy sign-up numbers. And then as the announcements about restructuring and redundancies were made, people started to withdraw. And in the end, the numbers were so low that we had to cancel the workshops. And instead, we worked to create an online training module in using place names, which is going to be offered to the National Trust staff as part of their suite of professional development opportunities. And actually, it was a little bit complicated. It was quite difficult towards the end of the project, but actually, that suite of being able to offer training as part of a suite that the National Trust hosts on its website, that's probably, I think, ultimately more impactful, will reach more people in that particular way. But it was a little bit bumpy towards the end when we were trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so what would I say to someone interested in collaboration of this sort? Well, the first thing is you don't necessarily know who might want to collaborate with you and why. So just take every opportunity to disseminate your research as widely as possible. So our collaboration sprang from just a slightly random talk in a museum. It was serendipity really in the first place that we had particular people in the audience and that they were able to make that talk that day. Then, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but connections that you make really need to be nurtured. And you need to think very hard about the needs of your partners. And that's time consuming. It's really time consuming to establish relationships and to build up trust before you embark on some kind of collaborative enterprise. Again, this is probably very obvious, but it's a good idea to start small to see if an idea can work and also to see if you can work with the partners. But once something clearly does work, it tends to gain a life of its own because collaborators have their own networks. And once they've decided you're a good thing, you get passed on to others by them. So we've ended up doing quite a lot of work with other local Shropshire organisations, but also some bigger players as well. So the National Trust works closely with Natural England, and I found myself invited to give a podcast and a training seminar also for Natural England archaeologists. So there's a kind of snowball effect as you go on. And the snowball effect, of course, is unfunded. It's not part of the original project, and you need to be ready for that time commitment. It can be a really considerable time commitment. I think it's fair to say that a successful collaboration, it doesn't really end, it just evolves. And that's great, but it presents its own challenges. And finally, you have to be ready to change your plans when you're working with other people. It just adds an extra level of unpredictability, but that can be one of the really good things about it as well. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you so much, Jayne. That's fantastic. Um, if you don't mind, I'll start by asking a few questions and then throw the floor open to everyone else. If you would like to ask Jayne a question, you're welcome to raise your hand, but also to, if you prefer to pop something in the chat, please do. Jayne, you've told us some fascinating things about how your collaboration came about and about how it worked and about the challenges and pleasures. I mean, is there anything else you'd like to add there? Other challenges or other pleasures you found from this extraordinary project?
Well, it was lovely being outside in the fresh air so much of the time. That was a good one. I think I did emphasize it during the talk, but Kath Landals is somebody who was already completely networked in a place. She was key to all of the collaborations really that we've had in the south of the county, beyond the ones that we forged initially with the original project. So we worked with the archives, for example, but that's a very traditional kind of partner for work within English studies, perhaps. Farming communities less so. And actually having somebody who already knows everybody, really good at, I mean, she's the community and engagement officer. She's fantastically good at her job. And I think for other projects, we've tried to make our own connections. For example, with schools, it's really hard. I mean, you can email a school 100 times and receive nothing back. But if you get in touch with somebody who already works with the school and they know will bring them good things, then it just makes all the difference. So having those key contacts for us has been key. And I'm sure that that's the case more broadly with collaborative activities.
No, thank you. That's fascinating. I mean, could you say a bit more too about what you and the team learned as a result of the collaboration? Because obviously, you had team members at doing slightly different jobs at slightly different career stages as well. So, and I mean, please do tell us more about that.
So gaining a better understanding of the contexts in which names arise. I've given you a couple of examples of that. And also, I suppose it was a really good exercise in not leaping to conclusions about what names might have meant. So I think there was one field in the Upper Onny area. It was called something like Darren's Leap. And we were assuming maybe that was something to do with a horse because we were imagining this rural environment. It was actually a field where somebody had constructed a ramp for a motorbike, and that's how it became known as Darren's Leap. So the lesson that we always tell our students that there might be stories behind the names that you couldn't even begin to guess at. There was a field I think called the Twins. And that was because there were two very impressive trees in the field. Again, without that story behind the naming, we would never have got there, I don't think. And I don't think those trees exist in the field anymore. So you couldn't even recover it with field work. So I think it was just interesting to know how far wrong you can go hypothesizing etymologies without some information about the motivations. So yeah, all sorts of different things. And also, we learnt a lot about people's relationship with place, and how names feed into that identity. Um, it was really amazing to be able to um, emphasize how valuable the information that we were getting from the farmers was as well, because I think particularly at the moment, the farming community perhaps feels as if it's a bit of a scapegoat for various things, and just going and establishing relationships and listening, valuing, and not wanting anything much out of it. We weren't telling the farmers what to do. We were saying, you're the experts about naming, about landscape. We can learn a lot from you. And we got the feeling that there weren't very many people saying that kind of thing to that community at the moment. And yeah, that was again something that we hadn't given any thought to whatsoever before the project, not really, but something that arose from it. That's a
Right.
slightly rambling response.
Not at all. No, no, no. Fascinating. And yes, and the information about Darren's leap was ordinary. But no, quite right too. This idea of learning, learning for that ability of being to be open-minded,
Mm.
and to listen and learn from what your partners have to say. It's crucial, isn't it? Um, I'm gonna stop and pass over to others. So Maggie, thank you very much for your question in the chat. Would you like to read it, or would you like me to read it for you? Um, Are you happy for me to read it? Okay, I will then. Okay, so Maggie, thanks you for an excellent presentation, Jayne. And it's really interested to hear about your applied approach to place names, and notes that there've been a few projects recently that look at ecology and history to help recovery. There's a lot of emphasis on outreach and impact of academic projects, so it's great to hear whether the project worked effectively. Oh, right, sorry, another question, sorry. And also about the blockers you encountered with such a complex project. Anything more you can teach the sector from this experience would be helpful. So, Jayne, anything else you can teach us from this extraordinary experience? And thank you,
Um,
Maggie.
yeah, hello, Maggie, by the way. I've just realized it's Maggie's spot. So, well, the so shortly after this project was funded by the HRC follow-on funding, they withdrew the scheme. And that felt like absolutely the wrong thing to do, because so much can come out of this kind of project. You don't know what necessarily is going to come out of the project. But I think having these kinds of schemes encourages people to explore the dimensions of their research that they wouldn't otherwise do, I suppose. And when the new, whatever it's called, the proof of concept scheme that they've just announced, when I saw that that was coming out again, I, I was quite interested in my response to it, which was a kind. I felt like giving a really big cheer, because I'm not sure people would necessarily find the time to do some of this work without that as an impetus. I think it's really valuable work, but it's very difficult to find the time to do it outside of formal funded projects. So I think if the sector can argue for funding for these kinds of activities and the continuation of funding for these kinds of activities, perhaps outside the strictures of the Industrial Strategy 8 goals as well, then that will be a good role for the English Association or other bodies like that.
Okay, thank you, Jayne. That's great. Other questions? Thanks, Maggie.
Could I come
Catherine,
in?
yeah.
Yeah. Um, I'd love to hear more about whether the farmers you were talking to were the National Trust, and it was really interesting what you're saying about the tensions between the trust and their tenants, and I was going to ask you about that, so it was interesting to hear you talk about it. But the other farmers as well, how whether this was useful for them, So some
Mm.
of the kind of changes in kind of policy, including some of the inheritance stuff, is making farmers think a lot um, about land and how they manage it, sort of, personally. And so place names can be quite helpful for that sort of thing. So I wondered whether there were ways in which the farmers were able to engage with your work that went beyond it's lovely to have the map on our wall, but that
Yeah.
was helping them think about their practice as farmers, not the National Trust, not the kind of, those kind of larger stakeholders, but the farmers themselves and how they were using the information you were working with them to co-produce.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had, for example, field names that were suggesting wetland areas that had been drained, and they were interested in the kinds of recovery projects and funding for the work to restore wetlands, that kind of thing. And so they were using the material as literally as signposts to where those kinds of things could be successful, where there had been wetland or a pond historically. So we know that there have been ponds restored in particular areas as a result of the project. They were very interested in some of the dialect terms which were indicating birds like snipe as well, so pointing to species that had been relatively common, presumably in the area, but were no longer. They were also interested in how the place name material might be used for diversifying. So so at Attingham, for example, on the Attingham estate in just outside Shrewsbury, they did have very big groups of school children coming in. And they had a sort of petting side to the farm as well as the more commercial side. And they were interested in resources to use with those groups coming in, but also how they might be used for people who were coming to stay in a bed and breakfast, whether we could help them devise walks across the land which took in the historical and present day names and therefore could explain a little bit more about the landscape through the names to those particular groups of people. So yes, again, they were seeing uses for the material that we perhaps had not anticipated. So we knew about obviously the nature recovery angle because that's what the Stepping Stones project was interested in. That's what the National Trust was interested in. The potential use of the material in tourism and to draw in groups, primarily for commercial reasons. That was something that again we we weren't focusing on, but we were happy to provide material. So we worked with the Attingham people to actually provide booklets that they could share with the teachers, bringing the school children into the farm. So yes, I hope they found it useful. We created a web app for the Epironi Farmers Group. I could actually put the link in the chat if that would be of interest. And also, we created a story map site. So again, that's an app within ArcGIS where you can draw in the maps that you create within the GIS and then attach a narrative to it. And they were interested in having that partly to encourage interest in the area to bring more tourists into the area.
Great, thank you. Really fascinating.
Thank you, Jayne. I've got a question actually. If that's okay, if you don't mind me asking another one. Um, your um, your project partners on this weren't particularly local, whilst it's not hundreds of miles to get from Nottingham to the Upper Onny. On the other hand, it's not just down the road, so you can't just pop and see them. So could you tell us something about the challenges of working with partners at a geographical distance, even not a particularly huge one, but nevertheless a geographical distance?
Yeah, the challenge is time. So it would take 2.5, 3 hours to get from Nottingham over to the south of the county. You can't do it in a day, so it's time and it's also money because you have to stay there. And within an externally funded project, that's manageable. In order to keep the relationships going and particularly to nurture the relationship with Kath, it has involved quite a lot of time investment and even some financial investment personally once those projects come to an end and you don't have the money to do that, but you can see the value in maintaining those relationships. Um, I think it can often fall back on the interest of the individual academic to keep those kinds of things going. Um, I have started to do more work more locally in Staffordshire, and my goodness, it's easier. And also, actually, the way things are going, the way things are moving, universities seem most interested in impact within the immediate area. So at Nottingham, there's a lot of interest in the city and in the county, and quite a lot of support for that kind of research, I think. If you pop up and say, actually, I'm interested in rural South Shropshire, um, they don't necessarily know what to do with you because it doesn't fit quite so obviously strategically with the university's civic um, responsibilities and civic aims. So that's an additional challenge. And I have wondered about the desirability of just doing much more in the East Midlands, simply for logistical reasons. But it's not. Yeah, I mean, we have the Peak District, we have some lovely countryside as well, but there's a big bit of my heart that's still in the south of Shropshire, I think.
Understandably so, Jane. Absolutely. Definitely understandably so. I mean, do you have any kind of top do's and don'ts for time management? I mean, it's a thing we all always have, look, all have to face with lots to do, far too little time to do it in. I mean, from your experience on this or other projects, what would your top do's and don'ts be?
Um, so so the thing that my concern at the moment is that that have a program of impact activities that have arisen out of research that was done really quite a long time ago now. And there's always a conflict between keeping that going and actually doing some more research so that at some point in the future you can engage in knowledge exchange activities with some new research. And actually it's a real battle because no, we don't have a great deal of time these days. And I think there's often a competition between you have to decide whether you're just going to sit down and get on with your research or whether you're going to do some of these dissemination activities. And it's pretty hard to find the time to do both. I don't know that I've got any top tips. I'm not sure I manage it very well.
No, I think you do, Jane, but I think you're being very modest. But no, no. But yes, you're quite right. It's something we all have to deal with, and that it's
Mhm.
not getting easier to
No.
at any sort. Yeah. I mean, what are your plans for this work going forward? These relationships or new relationships you're cultivating.
Um, so I mean, the National Trust are very keen to continue collaboration in some form. Um, And I think that I'm interested in broadening. So we've done some work nationally with them with the training, and I'm very interested to find out what the uptake of that work is and whether some of that training can be repackaged for other organizations. So the kinds of material that we've provided for the National Trust, could that be adapted for Natural England or for other organisations? So it would be interesting to extend it in that particular way. I I would like to retain some kind of West Midlands focus as well, but I'm interested in names in urban museum environments as well. So I have been talking to colleagues, colleagues at the Black Country Living Museum. So what could you do with names in a living museum context? Um,
Mm.
Again, West Midlands, but a really, really different kind of environment, very, very urban, but various urban centres in the West Midlands, in the moving northwest from Birmingham. There are centres that historically made locks or made springs and the names that is there a record of those specialisms in the name record for those places, and how could that be used by for tourism in a museum context there? So it's different because it's thinking about names in a very urban environment, um, but some of the questions are still the same as for projects like this. So we have all of this amazing material. We don't quite know what other people might want to do with it. Let's transport it into an urban environment and ask people in museums there how they would use it. Um, so maybe moving in that kind of direction. Slightly less scenic than the Shropshire Hills, but
Thank you, Jayne. No, thank you. That's great. Are there any other questions anyone would like to ask? Okay, well, in that case, then it just leaves me to thank Jayne for a wonderful and illuminating talk. So thank you very much, Jayne, and I'm wishing you and the team all the very best with all this great work in the future. It's really exciting. Thank you, and thank you for coming along today, and have a good weekend, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
Bye
thanks,
bye.
Linda.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.